The rain had stopped 3 days ago, but the smell of wet earth still filled the air. The wind carried a strange silence, one that made the small group of people in the valley feel as if the world had forgotten them. Their village used to be full of life. Children running by the river, old people sitting under trees, and the laughter of neighbors echoing from one house to another. Now it was quiet, empty, and broken. After the storm came the flood. It was stronger than anything they had seen before. The water rose so quickly that most people had to run with only what they could carry. Some made it to the main road where rescue vehicles took them away. But for those who lived deep inside the valley, like this small group, the water trapped them. When the bridges broke and the roads disappeared under mud, rescue teams stopped coming. At first, everyone thought it was just a delay. That help would come soon. But as the days passed, the reality became harder to ignore. No one was coming. The outside world had moved on to other places, other people. There were 7 of them left, 4 adults and 3 children. They gathered every morning near what used to be the schoolyard. It was now covered in thick mud, but it was the only open space left where they could see the sky. Every day they looked up, hoping for a helicopter or a plane. They would stand there for hours, squinting at the horizon only to see birds or drifting clouds. An older man, thin but strong, tried to keep everyone's spirits up. He reminded them that people had survived worse things before. "We're not the first to be left behind," he would say, "and we won't be the last to be found." His words helped for a while, but words can't fill empty stomachs or heal tired hearts. The small group shared what food they had left, mostly rice, a few cans of beans, and some dry bread. They boiled muddy water and filtered it through cloth to make it safe to drink. At night, they sat close together near a fire made from broken furniture. The flames danced against the dark sky, giving them warmth and the illusion of safety. Each person carried their own worry. The mother worried about her children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 7. The boy tried to act brave, pretending not to be afraid, but his eyes told a different story. The girl asked every night if they would go home tomorrow, and the mother didn't have the heart to say she didn't know where home was anymore. Sometimes, they heard distant engines, maybe rescue trucks, maybe something else. They would run to the top of the hill, waving their arms, shouting until their voices cracked. But the sound always faded. No one came. Days turned into weeks. Their clothes were torn, their shoes soaked with mud, and their bodies grew thinner. Yet even in that hopeless place, small acts of kindness kept them alive. When the boy found an unopened packet of biscuits floating near the river, he shared it with everyone. When the older man hurt his leg, one of the women made a bandage from her scarf and cleaned the wound with boiled water. Every night, before sleeping, they talked about what life was like before the storm. The sound of markets, the smell of cooked food, the noise of passing buses. They laughed quietly as they remembered silly things like a goat that used to chase children near the river, or a man who sang too loudly every morning. Those memories became their shelter when the world around them felt too empty. One morning they woke up to find that the river had changed course overnight. The flood had eaten away another part of the land, and what used to be the main road was now a broken path. The realization hit everyone at once, and they were truly cut off. For the first time, fear showed on every face. The mother looked toward the mountains and whispered, "What if no one knows we're still here?" The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. The older man tried to smile but couldn't. He looked around at the group, at their tired eyes, and he too seemed lost for words. They decided to make a plan. If no one was coming for them, maybe they could find a way to reach someone. They took turns climbing the nearby hill to look for any sign of movement, smoke, a light, or even a road. But every time they reached the top, they saw only endless trees and the ruins of their old world. At night, the stars looked clearer than ever. The boy pointed up and said, "Maybe someone up there can see us." Everyone smiled softly. In that moment, it didn't matter whether he meant God, space travelers, or anyone else. They just needed to believe that someone, somewhere, could still see them. The days blended together. Hunger became normal, silence became familiar, and hope became a habit, something they did to survive, like breathing. One afternoon, the mother found an old radio under the remains of a shop. Its battery was half dead, but she cleaned it carefully and tried to turn it on. At first, there was only static, but she didn't give up. Every evening, she tried again, sitting near the fire, turning the knob gently, listening to the noise. She said she could sometimes hear voices through the crackle, maybe news, maybe songs, or maybe her imagination. No one argued with her. They just sat close and listened too. That little radio became their connection to hope. Even if it said nothing, it gave them something to believe in. Then came the hardest night. The rain returned, this time softer but colder. Their firewood was soaked and they couldn't make a flame. They huddled under a piece of broken roof, shivering. The boy whispered that he could hear someone calling, but it was only the wind. The mother held both children close, closing her eyes tightly, pretending to sleep so they wouldn't see her cry. In the morning, everything was still. The valley looked washed clean but empty. The air smelled of wet leaves and ashes. One of the women said quietly, "It feels like we're the last people left." No one answered. Yet, deep inside, none of them wanted to give up. They had already lost so much in their homes, their neighbors, their sense of time, but they still had each other. That somehow was enough to wake up each morning and keep going. As the sun went down that evening, the older man stood by the river and said something that stayed with everyone. "Even when the world forgets us," he said, "the world still moves, and maybe someday it will move back toward us." They didn't know then how true his words would be. They didn't know that far away, in a rescue base miles from their broken village, a small signal had been picked up, a weak radio pulse from an old device still sending out faint energy. Someone, somewhere had just noticed them, but for now, the 7 survivors didn't know that. All they knew was the quiet sound of the river, the fading orange sky, and the thought that maybe, just maybe, they weren't completely alone after all. The days after the big storm started to blend together like one long, endless afternoon. The sound of the wind had softened, but the silence that replaced it felt even louder. The group of 7 people still gathered every morning near the open yard, looking up at the sky. They no longer spoke much during those moments. Hope had become something quiet, like breathing, something they did without thinking. The older man, whose leg was still wrapped in a piece of torn cloth, tried to keep everyone busy. He said that sitting still made the mind heavy, so they cleaned what was left of the school building. The children picked out dry wood to keep for future fires. The adults tried to make small shelters using broken doors and metal sheets. It wasn't much, but it gave them a reason to move, a reason to stay awake. Food was running out faster now. They had already finished the last of the rice and the beans had been stretched thin. Every meal was smaller than the one before. Sometimes they boiled leaves and roots they found in the forest. The taste was bitter, but they told the children it was soup. The children smiled and pretended to believe it. At night they sat together looking at the flickering light of their weak fire. The mother often told stories to keep the children calm. She spoke of the world before the flood, of city lights, colorful buses, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery near the road. Her voice was soft, but her eyes glistened in the firelight. Everyone listened silently, even though they had heard the same stories before. It made them remember that there was still a world beyond the valley. Sometimes the boy asked why no one had come yet. He couldn't understand how people could forget so quickly. The mother never had an answer. She only said, "Maybe they're still looking for us." But as the days turned into weeks, even that hope began to sound like a story. The radio that the mother had found still sat near the fire. She turned it on every evening, twisting the knob slowly, listening to the crackle and hiss. Some nights it was silent. Other nights it made small popping sounds that almost felt like a heartbeat. Everyone would lean in, waiting for a voice to break through the noise. But nothing ever came. The older man told her not to stop trying. Sometimes, he said, silence means something is trying to find you. The boy liked that idea. He said maybe the radio was like a lighthouse, sending light into the air so rescuers could find their way back. The others smiled. They didn't want to break his spirit. Days passed. The ground had begun to dry, but the world still looked gray. The river had pulled back, leaving behind piles of mud and broken things. The group searched through the debris every morning, hoping to find something useful. A tin can, a dry blanket, anything. Every small discovery felt like a gift. Once the girl found a small mirror. Its surface was cracked, but when she held it toward the sunlight, it reflected a bright flash. Everyone looked at it and thought of an idea. Maybe they could use the mirror to send signals. It was a small chance, but a chance nonetheless. So each day after breakfast, if you could call a handful of roots breakfast, They climbed to the highest hill and waved the mirror toward the sky. The light danced through the air like a secret message. They didn't know if anyone saw it, but the act of doing it filled them with purpose. After a week of silence, something strange happened. The boy said he heard a distant hum, a deep, steady sound like an engine. Everyone ran to the hilltop, their hearts racing. They listened carefully. At first it was faint, almost like the sound of wind moving through trees. But then it grew louder. They waved their arms and shouted even though they knew their voices couldn't reach that far. The girl lifted the mirror, reflecting sunlight wildly across the valley. For a few moments it felt like the world was coming back to life. But then the sound faded. The hum grew weaker until it was gone completely. Maybe it was just thunder. Maybe a plane passed too far away to see. Whatever it was, it left behind an ache that no words could fix. That night the fire burned quietly. The group didn't talk much. The older man poked the ashes with a stick, watching sparks drift into the dark sky. He finally said, "Sometimes the sound you hear isn't real. It's your heart, trying to remind you it's still there." The boy didn't understand what he meant, but the others did. They were all hearing things now. Footsteps in the distance, voices calling from the wind, the faint echo of laughter from the past. It was the mind's way of fighting silence. Despite the disappointment, they refused to give up. The next day, they decided to build a tall structure on the hill using pieces of wood and metal sheets. It looked like a small tower, crooked but strong enough to stand. They hung bits of colored cloth from it, hoping it could be seen from far away. It wasn't perfect, but when the wind blew, the fabric moved like a living thing. For them, that movement meant life. The children began collecting shiny objects, bottle caps, bits of glass, even metal lids. They hung them on the tower so they would sparkle in the sunlight. The hill became a symbol of their stubborn hope. Even when they were tired or hungry, they still climbed up each day to make the tower brighter. The older man started to write messages in the dirt with a stick. "Help us here," big enough to be seen from the sky. Every time the wind or rain erased it, he wrote it again. His hands were shaking and his back hurt, but he didn't stop. The others helped him, tracing the letters over and over until they became part of the ground itself. One night, the mother sat by the river, staring at the dark water. She whispered softly, as if talking to the world itself. "If anyone can hear us," she said, "we're still here. We're still trying." No one else heard her words, but something in the air seemed to carry them away. The silence that followed was deep, almost comforting. It was the kind of silence that makes you listen harder, as if the world is waiting to speak back. In the following days, the group grew weaker, but they also grew closer. They shared everything, not just food, but memories, dreams, and small jokes that made them laugh even in the middle of fear. The children began to collect smooth stones and draw faces on them using charcoal. They called them friends and arranged them near the fire every night. It made the group laugh, even though it was heartbreaking in its own way. But laughter, however small, was a kind of medicine. Time moved slowly. The sun rose and fell, and the moon grew brighter with each passing night. The valley had stopped feeling like home. It had become something else, a test maybe, or a waiting room between two worlds. Sometimes they saw birds flying high, and the mother would point and say, "If they can find their way, so can we." The children nodded, pretending to believe her completely. Every morning they still climbed the hill. Every evening they still turned on the radio. And every night they still told stories by the fire. It was during one of those quiet nights as they sat under a sky full of stars that the girl said something that made everyone stop and think. She looked up and said, "The stars don't move, but we still see them every night. Maybe help is like that. Maybe it's there even when we can't see it." No one replied. They just looked at the stars and let her words sink in. The days of silence continued, but now there was a small spark among them. Not loud or bright, but steady, like the last flame in a dying fire that refuses to go out. And somewhere, beyond the mountains, beyond the broken roads and rivers, someone had indeed started to notice a pattern of weak signals, a flicker, a pulse, something unusual coming from a forgotten valley. But the 7 people still didn't know that. To them, the silence was still endless. But what they didn't realize was that this silence was finally about to be broken. The morning started like any other. Gray clouds, quiet air, and the same routine of climbing the hill to check the horizon. But that day something felt slightly different. Maybe it was the air, Or maybe it was the way the wind carried a sound that no one had heard before. The group of 7 gathered near the old tower they had built, their eyes scanning the far end of the valley. For the past few weeks, nothing had changed. The mirror signals, the radio, the smoke fires might all had gone unanswered. But that morning the boy pointed toward the distance and said softly, "Did you hear that?" Everyone stopped. At first it was only silence again, followed by the rustling of leaves. Then faintly there came a steady hum, like a vibration deep in the air. The older man lifted his head and listened carefully. The sound grew a little louder, then faded again, then came back, as if the wind was carrying it closer and then pushing it away. They stood still, not breathing for a moment, afraid to believe too soon. "It could be thunder," someone whispered. "No," said the mother quietly. "That's something else." The hum disappeared after a few seconds, leaving only silence again. But the silence no longer felt the same. It wasn't empty now, it was full of wondering. They waited all morning, but the sound didn't return. Still, the group couldn't stop talking about it. Maybe it was a helicopter. Maybe it was a rescue boat. Maybe someone had finally heard their signals, even though there was no proof. Hope began to wake up inside them again, slowly, carefully, like a fragile seed pushing through dry soil. That afternoon, they decided to build another fire on the hilltop, bigger this time. They used all the dry wood they had been saving. Smoke rose high into the sky, forming a thick column that twisted in the wind. The children clapped their hands and said it looked like a signal to heaven. The mother smiled, even though she was tired. Her hands were rough and cracked, but her eyes shone brighter than they had in weeks. All day they watched the smoke rise. Every shadow, every shape in the distance made their hearts jump. Each time the wind shifted, they thought they saw movement far away. When night came, they sat around the fire again. The older man said maybe the sound they heard was just the wind bouncing between the mountains. But even he didn't sound convinced. Deep down, everyone felt something was changing. The radio, which had been silent for so long, began to make small popping sounds again that evening. The mother turned the knob carefully, holding her breath. There was static, then a faint voice, too weak to understand but real enough to make everyone freeze. They leaned closer, straining their ears. The voice faded quickly, but it had been there. A real human voice breaking through the noise. The mother started crying quietly. "Someone's talking," she whispered. "Someone out there is talking. No one slept that night." They took turns listening to the radio, hoping the voice would return. It didn't, but the sound of static was now their favorite sound, proof that they weren't completely alone in the world. The next morning, they worked harder than ever. The older man repaired the broken tower using pieces of metal he had found near the river. The boy and girl collected shiny glass pieces to hang from it, so that when the sun rose, it flashed light in every direction. It looked like a sculpture of hope, crooked, patched, but alive. Later that day, as the group gathered for their small meal, they saw birds circling above. It wasn't unusual to see birds, but these were flying in tight patterns, as if disturbed by something below them. The older man shaded his eyes and said, "Look over there. Something's moving." At the far edge of the valley, near the remains of the road, a faint glimmer of light appeared, just for a second. It wasn't lightning, and it wasn't the sun. It was a flash like glass reflecting light. Everyone froze. The mother stood up quickly, grabbing the mirror. She ran to the hill and began flashing it toward the same spot. 1, 2, 3. Waiting, then again. The others joined her, waving cloths and shouting as if their voices could travel miles. The light didn't move again, but that single moment was enough. The group felt alive in a way they hadn't felt since the flood began. That night they talked for hours. Every person shared what they thought they saw. Some believed it was a rescue team. Others thought it was just the sun catching metal debris. But no matter what they believed, everyone went to sleep with a little warmth inside. The warmth of maybe. In the next few days, the weather began to change. The sky was clearer, the river calmer. Nature seemed to have softened its anger. The children played near the water again, their laughter echoing faintly across the valley. For a moment, it felt like life was slowly returning. The older man suggested they start preparing for rescue. "If someone's coming," he said, "we should be ready." They gathered what little they had, and the radio, the mirror, a few pieces of dry food. They packed them carefully. not because they expected to leave tomorrow, but because it gave them a sense of direction. The boy carved small arrows on the ground pointing toward their camp, so that if anyone came from above, they'd know where to go. The girl picked flowers and placed them near the tower, saying she wanted rescuers to find something beautiful first. Every little act was filled with quiet hope. One afternoon, while they were sitting near the river, they heard the sound again, clearer this time. It came from far away, but it was steady, rhythmic, unmistakable. The older man stood up, his heart racing. The sound was mechanical, not thunder, not wind. They climbed the hill again, shielding their eyes from the bright sun. Then they saw it, far, far away, a small shape moving in the sky. It was tiny like a bird, but it moved differently, slower, with a sound that grew louder every second. No one spoke. They were too afraid to blink. The mother lifted the mirror and began flashing it again. The boy waved his arms wildly, shouting into the wind. The shape grew larger. It was no bird. It was something man-made, something alive. For the first time in weeks, joy and disbelief filled their hearts all at once. The girl began crying without knowing why. The older man dropped to his knees and whispered a prayer under his breath. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the sound faded again. The small flying object turned slightly and disappeared behind the mountains. They waited, calling, waving, shouting. But it didn't return. The silence that followed was heavy, but this time it didn't hurt, because now they knew something was out there. Something had been moving toward them. That night, none of them felt despair. Even though the craft had vanished, they could still hear the echo of its sound in their minds. The radio made small crackles again, as if trying to speak. The mother placed her hand on it gently and whispered, "We're here. Don't stop." The children fell asleep under the stars, their faces peaceful for the first time in a long while. The older man sat awake, staring at the dark horizon, listening to every sound, no matter how small. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, he believed tomorrow would bring something. The world had been quiet for too long, but now the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of being forgotten. It was the silence that comes before an answer. And far beyond the valley, in a small rescue station surrounded by mountains, a screen flickered to life. A faint radio signal had appeared, weak, unstable, but real. Coordinates flashed on the display. Someone looked at the screen, then called out to the team, "We might have survivors." Back in the valley, the wind carried a gentle sound that night, a whisper that could almost be mistaken for a promise. Help was coming. They just didn't know it yet. The morning began quietly, just like all the others. The valley was covered in soft mist, and the air was cool enough to make every breath feel sharp. The group of 7 woke up early, as they always did. The mother stirred the last bit of rice they had left, trying to make it stretch for everyone. The older man sat by the fire, rubbing his injured leg. The children chased each other in slow, tired circles, their laughter faint but real. It had been several days since they'd last seen that strange flying shape in the sky. No one was sure if it had been real or just a trick of their tired eyes. But deep inside, none of them could stop thinking about it. Every time the wind changed or a new sound echoed through the valley, their hearts jumped with hope. After they finished their meal, the mother took the small mirror and climbed up the hill again. The sun was rising behind the mountains, and golden light spilled across the valley. She began to flash the mirror toward the horizon. 1, 2, 3, just like she did every morning. The others joined her, waving bits of cloth and standing beside the tall wooden tower they had built weeks ago. The sky was quiet. They waited for an hour, maybe 2. Nothing moved. The children grew restless. The boy kicked a small stone and said softly, "Maybe they forgot again." The older man was about to answer when the girl suddenly gasped and pointed toward the far side of the valley. "Look," she cried. Everyone turned. At first it was just a dot, small and dark, floating in the distance. Then slowly it began to grow larger. The hum that followed was soft but steady, like a heartbeat in the sky. No one said a word. They just stared as the dot became a shape and the shape began to shine. The sound grew louder, and not thunder, not wind, a deep, rhythmic hum that filled the air and made their hearts pound. The children covered their ears and laughed with excitement. The older man's hands began to shake. "It's real," he whispered. "It's really real." The shape drew closer, and soon they could see what it was. a small aircraft, white and silver, gliding slowly above the valley. Its lights blinked gently, cutting through the morning mist. It wasn't a big rescue helicopter like the ones they had imagined, but something smaller, smoother, newer. It moved gracefully like a bird that knew exactly where to go. The group waved their arms wildly, shouting at the top of their lungs. The mother flashed her mirror again and again, even though her hands were trembling. The craft circled once, twice, then slowed down. It hovered in place, almost directly above them. The sound filled the entire valley, powerful but not harsh. For the first time in weeks, tears rolled down the mother's face. She covered her mouth, unable to speak. The older man dropped to his knees and let out a shaky laugh that turned into a sob. The children jumped and screamed with joy. They weren't forgotten. Someone had found them. The aircraft lowered a small object, a long rope with a box at the end. It landed near their tower, sending dust into the air. The boy ran to it, but the mother stopped him gently, afraid it might be dangerous. The older man limped closer and examined the box. On top of it was a small blinking light and a note sealed in plastic. He opened it carefully. Inside was a message written in large letters. "We see you. Stay where you are. More help is coming." He read it aloud and everyone froze. Then all at once the group began to cry, laugh, hug. All the emotions they had kept buried for weeks came pouring out like water breaking through a dam. The mother held her children tightly and whispered, "They found us. They found us." The aircraft stayed above for a few more minutes. A voice came from a small speaker on the box, crackly but human. "We're sending food and water. Don't move from this spot. Help is on the way." The voice faded in and out, but they caught enough to understand. Soon more ropes descended with bags attached, food packets, water bottles, blankets, even small first aid kits. The group gathered around the supplies, touching them carefully, almost afraid they might disappear if they blinked. They tore open one of the packets. Inside were biscuits, energy bars, and small cans of fruit. The children bit into them eagerly, their faces lighting up as they tasted something fresh for the first time in weeks. The older man sat down, holding a bottle of water with shaking hands. He looked at the label and laughed softly. "Never thought I'd be so happy to read words on plastic," he said. The aircraft stayed overhead a little longer, its blinking lights casting soft shadows on the ground. Then slowly it rose higher, tilted slightly, and drifted away toward the mountains. The sound of its engines faded, leaving only the rustle of wind and the quiet murmur of the river. But the silence this time was different. It wasn't heavy or lonely. It was peaceful, the kind of silence that comes after a miracle. That night, the group made a fire that burned bright and strong. They shared their food, spoke softly, and looked up at the stars. The mother turned the radio on again, and for the first time, she heard a clear signal, a voice saying their location, their valley, their names. Someone out there was talking about them. She pressed the radio close to her ear, tears falling freely down her face. "They're coming," she whispered. "They're really coming." The children leaned against her, sleepy but smiling. The older man sat quietly, staring at the sky. "That sound today," he said slowly. "That was the sound of humanity remembering us." The mother nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "It was." The next morning they were awake before sunrise. The air felt lighter. Even the birds seemed to sing differently. The older man walked to the river, cleaned his wound, and looked up at the sky with quiet gratitude. Around mid-morning the hum returned, louder, stronger, and this time, closer than before. The group ran to the hill again. Out of the horizon, two larger crafts appeared, flying side by side. Their lights blinked steadily, and their shadows stretched across the valley floor. One of them hovered while the other released something bright that floated slowly down, a beacon of orange smoke marking their position. A voice came through the radio again, clearer this time. "We see you. Stay where you are. Ground team approaching." The mother covered her mouth again, shaking with emotion. The boy jumped up and down, shouting with joy. The older man looked toward the mountains and whispered, "After all this time, they came back for us." Minutes later, they could see figures moving through the trees, people wearing bright orange jackets, carrying equipment and medical bags. The sight of other humans walking toward them made their knees weak. The rescuers waved their arms and called out. The group shouted back, their voices echoing across the valley. When the rescuers finally reached them, there were no grand speeches, no big words, just hugs, tears, and relief. The rescuers handed out more food and water, checked everyone carefully, and smiled reassuringly. "You're safe now," one of them said softly. The older man closed his eyes, whispering a thank you to no one in particular. The mother hugged her children, both of them crying and laughing at once. That night, as they prepared to leave the valley, the group looked back one last time at the hill where their tower still stood. The mirror hung from it, catching the last bit of sunlight and flashing a small beam into the distance, as if saying goodbye. The mother looked at it and said quietly, "That little piece of glass saved us." The older man smiled. "No," he said, "it was the people who saw it. Humanity's craft might have flown here, but it was made by human hands, and that's what brought us home." They walked slowly toward the rescue vehicles waiting at the edge of the valley. For the first time in a long while, the sound around them wasn't silence. It was life. The hum of engines, the voices of people, the promise of tomorrow. The valley that once felt like a prison now looked peaceful, almost beautiful. The wind moved gently through the trees as if whispering a farewell, and as the rescue craft lifted them into the air, the group watched the land below grow smaller. The boy pressed his face against the window and said softly, "We were down there for so long." The mother smiled and replied, "Yes, but they found us. Humanity found us." The older man closed his eyes, feeling the vibration of the craft beneath him, a sound he would never forget. It was the sound of being remembered, and for the first time since the storm began, every single one of them believed again, not just in machines or rescue teams, but in the quiet, stubborn kindness that still lived inside the heart of humankind. The rescue team had finally reached them. The sound of voices, footsteps, and equipment filled the valley that had been silent for so long. It felt like a dream, like they had stepped from one world into another. For weeks they had only heard their own echoes, but now there were new sounds everywhere. Laughter, shouting, the calm voices of people giving directions. The rescuers moved quickly, but gently. They checked each of the 7 survivors carefully, wrapping blankets around their shoulders, giving them clean water to drink. The older man sat on a rock, watching them with disbelief. "You're real," he whispered, as if afraid the rescuers might disappear. One of them smiled kindly and said, "Yes, we're real. And you're safe now." The mother held her children close while a medic checked their temperature and heartbeat. The boy kept asking questions, and where they came from, how they found them, if they had seen other villages. The rescuer answered patiently, explaining that they had been searching this area for days after detecting a weak radio signal. "Your signal saved you," he said. "We almost missed it, but someone noticed it in the middle of the night." The mother's eyes filled with tears. "So you heard us?" she asked quietly. The rescuer nodded. "Yes, humanity heard you." The team handed out warm food and soft bread, rice with vegetables, and small boxes of juice. The smell of real food made the group's eyes water. They ate slowly at first, afraid to finish too fast, afraid it might end. The children couldn't stop smiling. For them, the taste of something fresh was like a miracle. One of the rescuers gave the older man a walking stick. Another handed the mother a clean jacket. They spoke kindly, like old friends. The rescuers weren't just doing a job, they were showing care, respect, and relief. You could see it in their faces that they too felt something deep. Happiness that they had found people still alive. After everyone ate and drank, the rescue leader called out, "We'll move soon. We need to get you out before the next rain." The group nodded, but none of them wanted to leave the valley right away. It had been their prison, yes, but also their home. It was where they had fought, survived, and waited. They looked around at the broken buildings, the muddy paths, the little tower with its mirror still hanging. It all looked so small now, but it held their entire story. The older man touched the side of the tower gently. "We built this because we didn't want to be forgotten," he said softly. "And now look." They saw it. The boy ran up the hill one last time to wave the mirror toward the sky. The sunlight bounced off it, flashing bright across the valley. One of the rescuers laughed. "That's how we saw you," he said. The sun reflected off something shiny. "We followed it." The boy smiled proudly, holding the mirror like a treasure. The rescue team prepared to move. They brought stretchers for those who were too weak to walk and helped the others pack their few belongings. The mother only carried a small bag with the old radio inside. "It found them," she said quietly. "It deserves to come with us." They began walking toward the edge of the valley. The rescuers led the way, marking safe paths through the muddy ground. The air smelled cleaner that day, and the wind carried a warmth that felt almost new. The older man walked slowly but steadily, supported by two rescuers. He kept looking back at the valley. "You know," he said to one of them, "I thought the world had moved on without us." The rescuer looked at him and replied, "Sometimes the world moves slower than we think, but it never forgets completely." Those words stayed with him. As they reached the main road, the group stopped. Parked ahead were large rescue trucks, medical tents, and more people waiting. The survivors froze, staring at the scene. It was the first time in months they had seen so many humans in one place. The noise, the colors, the smell of fuel and food. It was almost overwhelming. The rescuers helped them into the trucks. Inside there were blankets, heaters, and more water bottles. The children pressed their faces against the window, watching the valley shrink as the trucks began to move. The mother sat quietly, holding their hands. She kept looking out the window, her eyes following the line of trees and the broken bridge in the distance. "We survived that," she whispered. The boy squeezed her hand and said, "We survived because someone cared." The road was long, winding through the mountains. The survivors stared out at the wide world they had been separated from for so long. There were other villages, other people, green fields, and even animals walking by. Every small thing looked like a miracle now. When they reached the rescue base, they were greeted with warmth and applause. Other survivors from nearby areas were already there. People offered blankets, food, and smiles. The children were taken for medical checks. The older man was given clean clothes and a bed. The mother sat on a chair holding a warm cup of tea. She hadn't tasted tea in weeks, and it felt like comfort itself. As night fell, the camp buzzed with quiet activity. Doctors, volunteers, and tired survivors all moving like one big family. But among all the noise, the small group sat together, watching everything with grateful eyes. A reporter came by and asked the older man about their story. He didn't speak much, just said, "Everyone left us behind. But humanity's craft found its way to us." The reporter smiled and wrote that down. Later that night, as they rested inside a tent, the boy asked, "Do you think they'll ever rebuild the village?" The mother looked thoughtful. "Maybe not exactly the same," she said. "But we'll rebuild something, even if it's just our hope." The older man added quietly, "When people care enough to look for those who are lost, it means there's still something good left in the world." Outside the tent, you could hear the gentle hum of machines, the voices of rescuers talking, and the soft murmur of people sleeping. It was a peaceful sound, the sound of life returning. The next morning, the group woke to bright sunlight. The valley that once trapped them was now behind them, and ahead lay open land, safe roads, and people who smiled when they saw them. They spent the day getting checked by doctors and receiving new clothes. The girl twirled around happily in her clean dress. The boy carried a small notebook given to him by a volunteer and began to draw the tower, the mirror, and the rescue craft that saved them. Every person in the group had something in their eyes that couldn't be described, a mix of relief, sadness, and quiet pride. They had been through the worst, but they hadn't given up. That afternoon, one of the rescuers brought a small screen and showed them pictures taken by the rescue drone. On the screen, they could see the valley, their tower, the tiny figures waving themselves. The mother gasped softly. "That's us," she whispered. The rescuer nodded. "That's how we found you. The drone picked up your movement. Your signal and your mirror reflected sunlight. It was like a heartbeat in the forest, and that heartbeat told us someone was still alive." The older man smiled, his eyes moist. "A heartbeat," he repeated. "Yes, that's what it was." That night, as the stars appeared above the camp, the group sat together once more. They shared quiet stories, not of fear now, but of gratitude. The mother held the old radio in her hands. She turned it on one last time, just to listen. The static was soft, like a whisper. She smiled and said, "This sound doesn't scare me anymore. It reminds me we were heard." The boy rested his head on her shoulder, his eyes closing. The older man leaned back, staring at the sky. "We were left behind," he said slowly. "But humanity came back for us. That means something." No one spoke after that. They didn't need to. The silence around them was no longer the kind that hurt. It was the kind that healed. The stars shimmered above them, bright and steady, like the light of that first craft that had appeared in the sky, the craft that carried not just supplies, but proof that compassion still lived in the world. And as they drifted to sleep under the gentle sound of the wind and distant engines, one thought lingered in every heart. They had been saved, not just by machines or technology, but by people who refused to stop searching, by humanity itself. The days that followed the rescue felt like living inside a dream. The group was no longer trapped, no longer waiting. They had beds to sleep in, food that was warm, and people who spoke to them with kindness. But even with safety around them, their minds still wandered back to the valley, the place that had changed their lives forever. At the rescue camp, everything moved in an organized rhythm. Doctors came every morning to check on them. Volunteers brought clean clothes and helped them write short messages to distant relatives, hoping someone would read and reply. The boy spent most of his time near the edge of the camp, watching the rescue helicopters take off and land. Every time one lifted into the air, the sound reminded him of the day they were found, that deep, steady hum that felt like a heartbeat in the sky. One afternoon, the mother sat under a large tent, looking at a small notebook a volunteer had given her. She started writing simple lines, trying to put into words what they had lived through. The words didn't come easily. How could anyone explain weeks of fear, hunger, and hope in a few sentences? But she kept writing anyway. She wrote about the nights when the wind howled through the valley and they thought no one would ever come. She wrote about the mirror, the tower, the radio that crackled with static. And she wrote about the moment when the craft appeared, when they realized that even though the world was far away, it had not forgotten them completely. When she finished, she read the lines softly to herself. They weren't perfect, but they were true. The older man, who was slowly getting stronger, spent his mornings walking around the camp with a cane. The rescuers called him Grandfather, even though none of them knew his name. He told stories to the children about the old days and about kindness, patience, and the power of people when they come together. Machines helped us, he told them one evening, sitting by the campfire. But it was people who made those machines, people with hearts, people who cared. Never forget that. The children listened quietly, their faces glowing in the firelight. The boy asked, "Do you think the world will ever forget people like us again?" The older man smiled, shaking his head. "No," he said. "Now they know we're out there, and they'll keep looking for others too, because that's what humanity does when it remembers its heart." As days passed, more survivors from other areas arrived at the camp. Some were weak, some were scared, but all of them carried the same look in their eyes, the look of people who had seen darkness and still held on to light. The small group who had been rescued first began to help them. The mother helped to distribute food. The children played with the new ones to make them feel safe. Even the older man sat with those who were too tired to speak, keeping them company in silence. It wasn't long before the boy was asked to share his story on a small stage set up in the camp. He stood there nervously, clutching the little mirror in his hand. The crowd sat quietly waiting. He took a deep breath and began. "We thought everyone forgot about us," he said softly. "The days were long. We were hungry, scared, but we didn't stop hoping. We built a tower and used this mirror to call for help. We didn't know if anyone would see us, but we kept trying." He paused and looked at the mirror. One day they saw the light. "They came for us. That's when I knew people still care." When he finished, the crowd clapped and some even wiped away tears. The rescue workers stood at the back, smiling proudly. The boy stepped down and gave the mirror to the rescue leader. "Keep it," he said shyly. "Maybe it'll help you find someone else." The leader looked at it for a long time before nodding. "We'll keep it safe," he said. "It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest signal can save lives." That night the camp felt different, lighter, more alive. People talked, shared food, and sang softly under the stars. The older man listened to the laughter and said, "This is what it means to be human, to fall, to suffer, and still find our way back to each other." The mother nodded quietly. "When we were in the valley," she said, "I kept thinking the world had ended. But now I see it didn't end. It just changed. And so did we." The next morning, the group was told they would be moved to a new shelter in the city. It was time to start rebuilding their lives. The children were excited, but the adults were quiet. Leaving the camp felt like saying goodbye to a family they had just found. Before they left, they visited the rescue aircraft parked near the edge of the camp. The same kind of craft that had found them weeks ago. The boy touched its side gently as if greeting an old friend. "This sound," he whispered. "I'll never forget it." The rescue pilot came over and smiled. "You don't need to," he said. "It's the sound of hope." As the trucks rolled out carrying them toward the city, the group looked out at the open road ahead. The sky was clear and wide, the sunlight warm on their faces. The mother watched the landscape pass by, rivers, forests, broken roads slowly being repaired. Everywhere she looked, she saw signs of people trying again, rebuilding, helping one another. When they reached the city shelter, they were given a small room, soft beds, and clean clothes. It wasn't much, but it felt like heaven. That night, as they settled in, the boy asked his mother, "Do you think we'll ever go back there?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe one day," she said. "To see it, not to live there. The valley will always be part of our story, but now we have to write a new one." The older man sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. "We spent so long in silence," he said, "and now the world sounds alive again. That's something to be thankful for." Days turned into weeks, and the group slowly adjusted to their new life. The children started school again. The mother began helping at a relief center, and the older man often visited the hospital to talk with other survivors. Everywhere they went, people recognized them. The ones who were found, they were called. But fame didn't matter to them. What mattered was that they were alive, together, and part of the world again. One evening, a reporter came to interview them for a short documentary. The camera was small, and the reporter spoke gently. "What did you learn from everything that happened?" she asked the mother. The mother thought for a long time before answering. "I learned that even when everything is lost and food, home, safety, there is one thing that never disappears: humanity. It may take time, it may lose its way, but it always returns," the older man added quietly. "And sometimes it returns in the form of a sound in the sky, a sound that says, 'You are not alone.'" The children smiled. Remembering that moment, the reporter asked one last question. "If you could send a message to the world, what would you say?" The boy spoke first. "Don't stop looking," he said. "Even when it's hard, even when you think no one is there, someone might be waiting for your light." The mother nodded, her eyes glistening. "And if you ever feel forgotten," she said, "remember that someone somewhere still cares." The documentary aired weeks later. People all over the world watched their story. Some cried, some smiled, and many sent messages saying how much it reminded them of kindness and hope. The rescue craft that had saved them was displayed in a small museum later that year, with a sign that read, "A reminder that humanity always finds its way home." And next to it, on a small stand, lay the boy's mirror, polished and bright, still reflecting light just like it did in the valley. Years later, when the group visited that museum, they stood in front of it silently. The boy, now older, smiled softly and said, "That tiny piece of glass, it carried our voices farther than we ever could." The older man placed his hand on his shoulder and said, "Yes, but remember, it wasn't just the mirror. It was your hope that shone through it." They left the museum and walked outside into the sunlight. The air was calm, the city alive. People hurried by, laughing, talking, living. The mother looked up at the sky, clear and endless, and for a moment she could almost hear that hum again. The sound of the craft. The sound of rescue. The sound of humanity. She smiled and whispered softly, "Everyone left us behind once, but humanity found its way back." And with that thought, they walked on, toward a new tomorrow, carrying the memory of the valley, the craft, and the unshakable belief that even in the darkest places a spark of light can always be seen, if someone chooses to look.